Thank you so much, and good morning and good afternoon, all. Firstly, thanks for being here and attending the training. And it was funny when I was watching Alvin's slides, because a couple of slides in the beginning are very similar, because the point is so important that we need to focus on. For example, the urban population increase. This is such an evident and important thing, that number of us living in cities, it's increasing day by day, and more than half of humanity now lives in urban areas and cities. And UN Population Division expects that this in 2030, a large number of inhabitants will be in Africa and Asian region. And in terms of mobility, then it's also a stress factor on the needs or the mobility needs of the people who are going to live in these cities. Similarly, we have seen the slide in Alvin's presentation on the growth of vehicles. So this is car sales. And between 2005 and 2019, the global passenger car sales increased 42%. And the most significant increase was actually found in Asia and Africa, African countries. And China and India had sales increase of 440% and 168%, respectively, between 2005 and 2019. And in terms of because cars is not the entire picture of an urban transportation system. In terms of two-wheelers, you would see here the registrations per 1,000 inhabitants in ASEAN countries. And an interesting thing here is that in 2017, on an average among the ASEAN countries, there were about 319 motorized two-wheelers for every 1,000 people, which is about 45% increase from 2010 data. And the highest share is in Vietnam, and followed by Indonesia. So since majority of our vehicles, they run on fossil fuels, still sources like petrol and diesel, this translates to when we burn them, there is a increase also in the air quality, and there are health impacts. But another important fact is the fossil fuel resources are finite, and we are depleting them at a faster rate than ever. In terms of health impacts, Alvin has shared a similar slide with you. So on the right, what you see is the estimate of deaths caused or attributable to tailpipe emissions. And the estimate as of 2015 is about 385,000 premature deaths globally are attributable to tailpipe emissions. And this this further bolsters the reason why we need a paradigm shift in our existing mobility developments. So now we come to, or we are all here to discuss e-mobility, which in very simple terms is urban mobility powered by an electric motor. And it has the potential to address the growing mobility needs in cities, yet it can address some of the negative externalities that are produced by the conventional urban mobility fleets. And especially when it comes to reduction of air pollution, deteriorating or better said, improving the environmental situation. But this has to come in a system. Towards the end, Alvin was mentioning about an ecosystem. And decarbonization is one of the things that we have high on the agenda of many countries and cities. And e-mobility could be a very important part of this decarbonizing puzzle, because on the face of it, e-mobility will not solve the congestion problems, but it will complement to the efforts, when properly implemented, to the efforts that the cities are currently making in promoting sustainability, because the key elements of sustainable transport, what we have seen, avoid, shift, improve, integrating transport modes, they all still apply also to e-mobility. And we see that the trends is if the transport sector wants to be CO2 free by 2050, with the existing technologies and the existing propulsion systems and the fuel that we use, it is not possible. We need to switch to an alternative powertrain technology, and this demands for a greater need of integration between the energy sector and the transport sector. This is more than ever before. But at the same time, when we talk about e-mobility, it is not just about vehicles, because shifting to electric mobility does not just involve purchasing an electric vehicle, though, I mean, it's an initial and essential step. The decision to shift to electric vehicles also involves various factors that need to be considered. For example, the range of the electric vehicles that are out there, and the availability of charging infrastructure, the battery life, and the battery disposal. And in order to provide a complete solution to the end user, there is a need for various entities to work together. And some of them you see on the slide here. For example, you have the manufacturing sector needs to innovate the kind of EV models that are out there, electric vehicle models. And then there needs to be a battery innovation so that recycling recycling happens in a much more environmentally friendly way, and new battery technologies require less of the valuable resources. And a private sector involvement is required for providing charging technologies and providing charging stations. And a very important role is played by the governments, because the governments are required to enact policies and develop enabling frameworks for the adoption of electric vehicles and make conventional automobiles less attractive. And overall, deploying an EV strategy is a mix of all these sectors, including government, energy providers, ICT, vehicle manufacturers, and various transport operators. In addition to integrating or identifying these stakeholders, it's also important to integrate electric mobility into our urban mobility planning practices. The picture you see here is from the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan process. It's a European mobility planning approach. A similar plan might be available in your respective countries. In India, for example, it's called the Comprehensive Mobility Plan, or CMP. And the key elements that we need to keep in mind are that we, or the city leadership, needs a clear ambition and a vision where they want to go, so that this helps us in identifying the correct solutions that we will be implementing. And a detailed plan is required that defines what the needs of the end users are, because if we don't consider the needs of the end users, then whatever we implement in the city might not match the needs. And a well-executed implementation of measures is, of course, required that engages all the stakeholders that are involved in the implementation. So in this slide, you see on a broad scale, the various key stakeholders that are required for implementing e-mobility solutions. So governments, and be it local governments, subnational or national governments. They are a key element. And then we have the private sector, the transport operators, the manufacturing sector, and then the consumers and the battery manufacturers. So in this presentation, I'll be mainly focusing on the role of public authorities, but I have one slide for the service providers. Maybe I'll go to the service providers right after this. But I wanted to mention that on the Solutions Plus website, I think Alvin briefly mentioned about the toolbox. So the toolbox is an online resource where cities and the others can get information on the roles of various stakeholders or case studies and stuff. So there will be more roles described on the toolbox. So I invite you to visit the Solutions Plus website and get more information on the other stakeholders. So coming to the role of service providers, so they are essentially the private sector, and their main role, or they start with researching and analyzing the markets, and then they create a unique selling product or unique selling point, and they develop the business model and the pricing strategy, and then roll out their solution into the market. And service providers will emerge wherever there is an opportunity or a gap in the current mobility offering. I'm talking about service providers in the mobility sector. Right now, if you see in many of our cities, you see a lot of paratransit operations happening, and this can also be termed as entry from private operators into the transport sector because there is a gap in service. So the same thing would happen also in e-mobility. But in such an event, if the governments react proactively, and if provided the intervention complements to the vision of the city and of sustainable transport, there can be a great synergy that can be tapped, as the service providers usually do most of the spade works for the government. So the market research, analysis, and the business model aspects, these are all already done by the service providers. And the important thing is governments have a lot of authority, and they can either let interesting or innovative solution grow, or they can even squish some interventions that are unfavorable. At the same time, this authority puts a lot of burden also on the governments, because they need to be also informed on making the right decisions, and so that a right solution is put forward into the market. And in most cases, governments need to provide these enabling conditions and create a level playing field in order to create a healthy competition in the e-mobility solutions plane. And at the national level, the governments need to take care of regulatory and legislative frameworks that create a level competition. And standardization and standardizing the infrastructure is something that's a very important thing, especially when it comes to e-mobility, because it will enable the e-mobility system to grow in a very healthy manner. There are cases in the early days of e-mobility implementation that lack of standardization resulted in lock-in technologies, so there's only one kind of solution. And when something like that happens, then there is a segregation in the consumer base, and this is not something as a government we want in the e-mobility sector. Also, enabling a collaborative environment for the public and private entities to work together is something governments can facilitate. I mean, we talked about integration. I mean, integration does not stop just with physical integration of infrastructure, but there should be an integration within the government, and there should be an integration among the stakeholders that are involved in the e-mobility implementation. Another obvious role that the governments play, which we are all aware of, is the fiscal incentives. I mean, they have the resources, or they could provide the resources that would allow e-mobility sector to grow. And the incentives need not be always in terms of finance. They could be incentives that attract manufacturing, reduction in import duties, and incentives like that. Tomorrow we have a presentation on the policy frameworks, and there we'll be talking more about this. So from a local perspective, from the local governments, I mean, incorporating e-mobility into local transport planning is mainly through providing local incentives, such as something that's very common in Europe is providing free parking for electric vehicles, and also supporting private entities in or entities in providing charging infrastructure. And in some cases, charging piles have to be put on land that belongs to the city, and there the city can actually help the charging companies. And further encouraging the local innovators, because there is usually in many of our cities, there is a small element of e-mobility that is already happening. And identifying these local innovators and encouraging them can result in having e-mobility solutions that are born locally and developed. This you have seen actually in the presentations from our cities, from the Solutions Plus, and over the days you'll be hearing a lot more about them. So in order to implement these, or in order to fulfill these roles, there are a wide range of tools that are available for policymakers. I mean, what I show on the screen is maybe a sliver of the tools that are out there. I mentioned incentives earlier, and there is direct incentives, and there are also indirect incentives that, such as free registration for electric vehicles. I said reducing and removing import duty, and subsidizing charging possibly, and thinking about trade-in program for conventional vehicles. And also, depending on the objective the government has, so this links back to the vision and the kind of city we want. Depending on such target, governments can also implement certain other policy measures. For example, what many cities in Europe do is air quality is a very important aspect, and to improve air quality, certain areas in a city are declared as low emission zones, wherein not all cars or all automobiles can enter. And this, they are taking it to a next stage, saying zero emission zone that allows only electric vehicles and public transport to apply in the area.
汽车传统的汽车进入，然后在这个地区的话，就可以去使用电动公交车或者是电动车。
I'm suddenly hearing Chinese Mandarin, but yeah. So and coming back to the slide, and so another important thing that governments have a responsibility is in terms of communicating the benefits of electric mobility, because the end user needs to have factual information on what is going to happen in their city and to their daily commute. And they need to know why they have to move away from conventional cars and then move to electric vehicles. And this is something that can be achieved through effective communication campaigns. And here, the media plays a very important stakeholder for be it the governments or all the other e-mobility stakeholders in sending this message across to the end users. So an effective communications campaign can allow us to achieve that goal. So to wrap it up, so I mean, we have seen time and again that e-mobility plays an important role in decarbonizing transport, but I want to reiterate that e-mobility is not the solution for all the transport problems. E-mobility is a solution to address some of the externalities in transport problem. We still have to promote sustainable transport in an integrated fashion, talk about land use and transport integration. All of these still are there on the table, and we cannot just ignore them and just say implementing e-mobility will solve all the problems, and that's not going to happen. And switching to e-mobility is not just converting all our vehicles, but it's rather an ecosystem. We need to think about the kind of energy that's being generated, how it is transmitted and distributed, and the kind of charging infrastructure we are going to have, what standards, how many chargers do we have. So it's a complete system, and it requires involvement of various stakeholders, the governments, the private entities, the battery manufacturers, etc. And from our perspective, governments have a key role in implementing electric mobility because they set the vision for the city or the state or the country. And engaging these different stakeholders is necessary right from the beginning for identifying synergies and implementing a successful e-mobility system. So thank you so much for your attention.